The theme of war in the colonies provides an interesting perspective, challenging the thesis of the victory of the Entente, which, if it's undisputable in Europe, it's less obvious in the colonial territories. However, with respect to the events that took place in Africa during the First World War, the historiography still shows a strong Eurocentrism. The participation of Africans to the war is mostly limited to colonial troops or colonial workers. In any case, the discourse tends to paint Africans as passive victims of the war, without any real active role in the events. It seems like the only way to take part to the global war was a colonial way. The history of the World War I in Africa can be read only with the lenses of colonialism. And the aim of my paper is to underline the active role played by Africans in the First World War. Not all Africans have been dragged into the conflict by the colonial masters, taking part to the conflict only as colonial soldiers or colonial workers. Some chose to fight or not to fight, being aware of the international context, being aware of the stakes. Just to mention two examples, the Ethiopian case, especially the diplomatic and political efforts of Libyas, and the Libyan case that I'm going to analyze. If Italy managed to contain the Turkish-German pressure in the colonies of the Horn of Africa, Eritrea and Somalia, in North Africa the connection between the Libyan rebels and the Central Empires fueled a conflict that lasted until November 1918, resulting in the loss of the so-called Fourth Shore by Italy. The question is whether this huge Libyan battlefront, which opened in November 1914 with the revolt of Fezzan, Libya's southern region, can be considered a battlefront of the First World War, and therefore, if it can be compared to the Italian Eastern Front that engaged the troops from May 1915. Or if the conflict that broke out in 1914 and lasted until 1918 should be simply and only considered as a phase of the 20-year war that saw on one side the Italian troops and on the other side the Libyans. In the first case, the beginning of the Great War for Italy should be backdated to November 1914, the outbreak of the uprising in Fezzan, instead of May 1915. The colonial war fought between Libyans and Italians did not stop in the 4 years from 1914 to 1918. It was simply absorbed by the war. The Libyans joined the alliance led by Germany and Turkey, while Italy approached the Entente. This widening of the alliances changed the very character of the conflict, which could count on new and significant resources and move on other lands, crossing the borders of the country. For example, the Sanusi attack to Egypt and the fight of the Berber leader Khalifa bin Askar against Italians in Libya and the French in Tunisia. The anti-colonial movement, the Jihad, emphasized its strong international dimension that had already manifested itself in the first phase of the anti-colonial struggle from 1911 to 1912. The readiness with which the Libyan rebels understood the new international situation and sided with Berlin and Istanbul represented a crucial advantage over the Italian enemy. The ability of the Mujahideen to align their goals with those of the Central Powers turned Libya into a theater of the Great War. It must be underlined that was the Libyans' attitude that turned Libya into a theater of the global conflict. They were not dragged into the conflict by their colonial masters, also because since November 1914, Italy has practically lost control over the country, and by the summer 1915 has withdrawn most of the troops from North Africa. While the Libyans had soon turned their anti-colonial struggle and their country into a battlefield of the global conflict, Italy tried to stem the revolt according to the strategy of a traditional colonial war, without being able to count on the concrete support of its English and French neighbors and, starting from April 1915, allies. From the Libyan point of view, the conflict against the Italians became only a part of a wider project that included a war against all the colonial powers ruling North Africa: Italy, French, and United Kingdom. From 1914 on, the Libyan rebels did not conduct their fight exclusively against the Italians, but widened their political horizon, ceasing to consider Libya as their only battlefield, extending their military action to neighboring countries like Egypt and Tunisia. I've already mentioned the case of the Berber leader Khalifa bin Askar fighting across the border between Tunisia and Libya against French and Italians, while in the east, the Grand Senussi, Ahmad al-Sharif, attacked Egypt, leading a battle against Italians and English at the same time. The attempted invasion of Egypt is perhaps the clearest example of the strong international dimension of the Libyan jihad, and a demonstration of the global role played by the Libyan jihad during the World War. Since November 1914, the armies of Ahmad al-Sharif had concentrated in the Amsiat camp, near the Egyptian border, waiting to launch the attack on the east. In addition to the Senussi troops, a good number of Turkish and German officers were present in Amsiat, whose support was crucial. For example, the Libyan coast became a docking point for German submarines landing weapons in Libya. Also, must be underlined that some of the Ottoman officers had already taken part in the Italo-Turkish War, fought between 1911 and 1912, and had maintained contact with the leaders of the Libyan jihad. The aim of the Ottoman and German commands was to put in place a pincer movement against Egypt, invading it from the south, Sudan, from the west, Cyrenaica, and from the east. The defeat of the British troops would have allowed the Ottomans and the Germans to control the Suez Canal, strangling the trade that from the colonies reached the United Kingdom. This would eventually have decreed the collapse of the English Empire in northern and eastern Africa. The decision of Ahmad al-Sharif to attack Egypt with the support of Germany and the Ottoman Empire turned Cyrenaica into a strategic theater of the First World War, where two sides faced each other. On one side, Italy and England, on the other side, Germany, the Ottoman Empire, and Sanussia. It's clear that the Libyans were not fighting a colonial war, but a world war. It's also clear that they took part to the global conflict, playing an active role and being fully aware of their goals. Libya gained a crucial role, not only from the German and Ottoman point of view. Libya became a very attractive place for those who were involved in the anti-colonial struggle. Several of them flew to Libya to join the Libyan jihad. Just two examples. Ja'far al-Askari, who later became Prime Minister of Iraq, and Abdurrahman Azzam, an Arab nationalist who later became the first Secretary of the Arab League. In his book, Dirasat fi Tarikh Libya al-Hadith, the Libyan historian Aqil al-Barbar underlines the essential role of those political figures, like Abdurrahman Azzam, that promoted the inclusion of Libya in the international network that linked men and political groups that oppose European penetration in Africa, a network that has been strengthened during the war. It's interesting how a peripheral and marginal country like Libya gained such a crucial role in the years of the Great War. This significant role was due to the international dimension of the Libyan jihad that can be explained by referring to the power of the pan-Islamic message and the difficulty in setting up a national discourse because of the historical division that characterized the country's political dynamics. This explains the attitude of many Libyan leaders whose horizon was not Libya, not even Tripolitania or Cyrenaica, but the whole North Africa, as the politics of Ahmad al-Sharif demonstrated. In 1916, everything changed. The international dimension of the Libyan jihad must come to terms with the defeat of the Senussi in Egypt. That meant also the defeat of the pan-Islamic project supported by the Grand Senussi. I think it must be also mentioned the revolt that broke out in Hijaz in 1916 against the Ottoman rule that caused a crack in the pan-Islamic movement. 1916 was a crucial year in Libyan history. The defeat of the Senussi was simultaneous to the defeat of the other political group that had considered the war as a global conflict, not only a colonial war. I mean the Berbers living in West Libya, engaged in a struggle against French and Italy. To continue, the jihad needed to limit its horizons, operating within the borders of the country. Starting from 1916, after the defeat of the Senussi and the Berbers, the war fought by the Libyans lost its transnational and transimperial character, to acquire again the appearance of a colonial war, which saw on the one side the Italians and on the other side the Libyans. So the country, which had played a strategic role in the conflict between the two sides in North Africa, returned to be marginal and peripheral. The year 1916 meant also the defeat of the Pan-Islamic project, closely related to the project supported by Germans and Ottomans to oust the British and the French from North Africa. The setting aside of the ambitious Senusian project for the liberation of North Africa from the European colonial control, as well as the Berber project for the liberation of the Tunisian and Libyan Berbers from the French and Italian yoke, caused the emergence of an embryonic idea of Libyan nation. So in conclusion, who did win the war in Libya? Starting from the winter 1914, Italy had to face a massive and popular uprising led by the anti-colonial leaders and supported by Germany and Turkey. Within a few months, the Italian colonial government withdrew the troops from the country, leaving the territory in the hands of the leaders of the rebellion and their German and Ottoman allies. If we consider Libya as a battlefront of the Great War, just like the Italian Eastern Front, where Italy had to face Austrian and German troops since May 1915, it can be said that for Italy, the Great War ended with a victory in Europe and a defeat in Africa. If the Italian defeat appears clear, it's more difficult to understand the position of the Libyans. If the ambitious goals set at the beginning of the conflict by the forces that had triggered the revolt had failed because Egypt had not been liberated from the English control, France maintained control over Tunisia, and finally the coalition led by Ottomans and Germans had been defeated in 1918, still the Mujahideen were the masters of the country. They had lost the World War conducted against all the colonial powers of North Africa, but had won the colonial war against Italy. Moreover, I think the Libyan case demonstrates that Africans took part to the Great War not only as colonial soldiers or workers, playing subordinate role, but in some cases, the Libyan case, as well as the Ethiopian case, they played an active and significant role. Thank you.